So, تسكين ذلك الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. فقد نوينا التعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على خير، وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah. Hope everyone is rested. This is our final day, but hopefully one of many to come in the future, inshallah. It is always a blessing to have new faces and new visitors here at Al-Maqasid, but it's sad to see them go. But alhamdulillah, they always come back. And we hope that we have these connections in this world over and over and over again after long lives of obedience and ease and well-being. And then we have the ultimate retreats in paradise that never ends. And you're never tired. And there's never a shortage of coffee or food. So because we don't need them there. Inshallah ta'ala, may Allah make us all of the people of paradise, inshallah. Tamam. So we have another, mashallah, very detailed discussion of Imam al-Ghazali, and again the book 14 of the Ihya Ulumuddin, as Sheikh Yahya mentioned, is very, very technical, and if you just peruse the translation, you'll see that the different types of breakdowns that he gives and the different examples that he gives of each, and each one has its own types, subtypes, and it's very tricky to distill down into a very short weekend program. Something like that would be a book that a scholar could spend months and months and months with and still not even scratch the surface. But at the same time, and this is one of the prophetic nature of this tradition, is that things can be studied at different levels at the same time. So a beginner can take from the Quran much of what they need. Right? But a person who's been doing it for 30, 40, 50 years, who's a master at Arabic, is also taking and still not getting to the bottom of the ocean. Right? So, and this is the nature of revelation. That revelation is for absolutely everyone. Right? For the general public, as well as for the scholar, for the person who is struggling with sins, and the person who has never even done a disliked thing in their entire life. It's for everyone. And alhamdulillah, just as Sheikh Yahya described the 9 levels of religious practice, that all of them are min ibadina, from the verse of the Quran, that all of them are our servants. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and all of them are chosen. ثُمَّ أَوْرَثْنَا الْكِتَابَ الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا مِنْ عِبَادِنَا. Then we bequeathed the revelation to those who we have chosen of our servants. And some of them wrong themselves, and some of them are of the middle path, and some of them are the foremost in good deeds. Right? So all of them are chosen because they're chosen to be of the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. And all we're asked to do is try our best based on knowledge that is connected back to the Prophet ﷺ. And if we fall, we dust ourselves off and we get back up. And perhaps that fall, as Sheikh Yahya mentioned in the interactive session, perhaps that fall could catapult them forward in the path because of the states of the heart that changes through humility and remorse and brokenness. As Ibn Ata'illah as-Sakandari mentions, رُبَّ ذنب أورث ذلا وانكسارا خير من الطاعة أورث عزا واستكبارا. That perhaps a sin that brings about a state of brokenness and humility is better than a good deed that brings about a state of arrogance and exaltedness. So we never lose hope. We never lose hope in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we are tasked with one thing: to be sincerely true with Allah and try our best, based on knowledge and based on the guidance of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So one of the ways that we can actualize that goal is to understand where these limits lie, as we've been talking about the halal and haram. And between the two, between the halal and the haram, right? Because as we'll see in this hadith, that they are clear, they're obvious. But between the two is where the real crux of the matter is. So we'll start, inshaAllah ta'ala, and we're going to again aim to try to leave some time for questions. We'll start with the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. This hadith is narrated in Bukhari and Muslim, in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. There is also multiple narrations in Sahih Bukhari of the same hadith, and just various variations in the wording, but even the variations in the wording are of great benefit. So I'll just read the hadith straight through. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "The lawful is clear, al-halalu bayyinun, and the prohibited, that which is prohibited, is clear, wal-haramu bayyinun, wa baynahuma umurun mushtabihat, and between them are doubtful matters, la ya'lamuhunna kathirun minan nas, that many people do not have knowledge of." So whoever abstains from the doubtful matters, فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الشُّبَهَاتِ, فَقَدْ اسْتَبْرَأَ بِدِينِهِ وَعِرْضِهِ, then they have preserved their religion and they have preserved their honor. And whoever falls into the doubtful matters, they will definitely fall into the prohibited. It is just like a shepherd herding his sheep near the private property of a king. It is very likely that the sheep cross over into that land. So this is very picturesque kind of metaphor from the Prophet ﷺ that was very relevant for them at that time. And Shaykh Yahya explained this metaphor about the sheep grazing near the private property of the king. Right? And so we don't have to go into that as much. Just like, for instance, if you let your children play, but you let them play near for instance, a hole in the ground or some construction or something. If you let them play near the hole, then there's a possibility of them falling in the hole. So what's the intelligent person, or the one who's really has care for their child, would say, don't play near the hole, not even go close to it, right? Because there's no possibility of ever falling in the hole if you're on the other side of the field, on the other side of the playground, or on the other side of the area. So this is the same idea with doubtful matters, that there's limits, that these things over here are haram, right? These things over here are halal, and then there's some gray area things, right? The closer that we get to that side over there, the more likely it is that we'll cross that line and not know, or cross that line because we're overcome by our desires or something else. Tamam. And this is one of the metaphors that I've heard actually from a great da'i in Boston. May Allah reward him. He was a convert, mashallah. Many people became Muslim at his hands. He was giving the example that when a person enters Islam, right? So they give the example that Islam is like a house, right? You're entering Baytul Islam, the house of Islam. So when a person first enters Islam, are they closer to the door, or are they closer? Are they already in the depths of the house yet? They're right at the door. So it's very likely for that. It's very easy to just take one step back and they're out again. So there's a fragility to that first level of Islam, that first few days, that first few months, that even the first few years for some of us. But as they grow in their Islam, they grow in their knowledge, they grow in their practice, they grow in their closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they grow in their belief in Allah, both intellectually but also spiritually, that they start getting further and deeper and deeper and deeper into that house, to where it is almost impossible for them to leave Islam like that. Right? There's a large series, and that's the same thing that Shaykh was talking about, the nine levels. If someone is at level 5, there's no way they're gonna go down to number 1 right away. Right? There's a slow erosion of these things, and then they fall back possibly. But if someone's at number 1, they're really in the danger zone. So it's the same idea with these doubtful matters, that there's the limits of the haram. Right? If someone is dwelling in the land of doubtful things, it is very easy for them to slip into the haram. But if someone has made their life such that they are only in the halal sphere, it's almost impossible for them to get all the way over to here. And when we understand the whispers of shaitan and the tricks of shaitan, there's a really beautiful book called Talbisul Iblis, the deception of shaitan. The deception, I think the devil's deception is translated as. A very good book, definitely worth the read. So he mentions there that if someone is very pious, someone's praying their 5-time prayers, they're guarding their gaze, they're guarding their tongue, they're respectful to their parents, Shaitan is not going to call them to do fornication. He's not going to call them to drink alcohol. He's not going to call them to do major sins, because that's far-fetched. They will never fall for that, right? But he might call them to delay a prayer. He might call them to do a lesser of 2 good things. He might call them to lose their anger once, right? And slowly it starts to delve back into that level of the haram. So with this as a framework, there's another narration in Sahih Bukhari where the Prophet ﷺ is similar in the beginning, but the second part is a little bit different. He says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the permissible is that which is lawful is clear, and that which is prohibited is clear, and between the two are doubtful matters. So whoever leaves that which is doubtful of sins, right, then it is more likely that they would leave the haram. It is more likely that they would leave that which is actually absolutely haram. And whoever is brazen enough to dive into those things that there is doubt in, then it is very likely that they will fall into that which is haram. And he says that the disobedience of Allah is Allah's private land. It's the hima of Allah, it's protected land. So whoever grazes near that protected land will definitely eventually fall into it. So there's a little bit different wording, but we can see the same idea, that someone who is living in the world of the doubtful, it is much more likely for that person to fall into haram than for someone who is leaving that which is doubtful. Tamam. And there's other hadiths as well of the Prophet ﷺ in regards to leaving doubts. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Da' ma yuribuka ila ma la yuribuk." Leave that which causes you doubts for that which does not. Leave that which causes you doubts for that which does not cause you any doubt. Tamam. So in this hadith we have 3 categories, right? We have 3 categories. We have that which is clearly lawful, and we can describe that as something, as Imam Ghazali describes it, as something that is free from any intrinsic qualities that make it prohibited, as well as those things that are free from secondary factors that would lead to it becoming prohibited, right? So if we had an example, like for instance, that we mentioned the basis of most things is permissibility until they're proven otherwise. And with a few exceptions, we talked about meat. The exception there is meat, that meat is considered prohibited until proven halal. We talked about the permissibility of intimacy between spouses, right? There's conditions to the nikah, there's conditions to the wedding, to the marriage. So until those conditions are actually met, then it is prohibited until proven that those conditions are met. And there are other things. But something that is intrinsically permissible would be like water, right? And then there's no secondary factors that would lead to that water becoming impermissible. Like for instance, someone mugs someone, steals their $10, right, and buys a Fiji water, and then comes and says, "Here, you want this water?" Right? So the water itself is halal, right? It's clearly halal, halal bayyunun, right? It's clear, and right. So there's no impermissibility there, right? And if it's free from any secondary matters like that, right, then it is absolutely permissible. And that is wadih, that's obvious, even to those who have not fully studied for many years. It's not a requirement that they have to have studied. It's clear. Then there is the second category, is the doubtful, which the Prophet described as la ya'lamuhunna kathirun minan nas, that most people or many people do not know about them. Meaning many people do not know which of the 2 categories they fall in. Are they of the halal or are they of the haram? But this statement of the Prophet ﷺ that many people do not know, right, leads us immediately to think that some people do. Right? That there are people who do know where these things lie, whether they're halal or whether they're haram. And there's a subtle indication there to a connection to scholarship, a connection to people of knowledge to refer back to make sure, is this of the first category or of the second? Is it of the halal or is it of the haram? Tamam. And then we have our final category, which is that which is clearly prohibited, right? And this is something that has either intrinsic qualities of prohibition, right, which they're listed out clearly in the Quran and in the Hadith, We have the Prophet ﷺ said that of the major sins is associating partners with Allah, to be disrespectful to the parents, to kill somebody, and to make an intentional oath by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is false. Right, so those are 4. And the book of major sins by, I believe it's Ibn Qayyim al-Jawzi, is also a place to see that. So you see in the Quran, we see about killing people without rights. We see about fornication. We see alcohol, gambling mentioned. We see pork or swine mentioned. We see wine mentioned. We see fornication mentioned. We see usury mentioned. These are the things that are categorically haram. Intrinsically, they're intrinsically haram to them, they are generally permissible, but because some secondary element has entered, that they became impermissible. They became clearly impermissible, like the water that we just mentioned that was purchased with stolen money. Right, so now, because of the stolen money, the water is now impermissible clearly, right, without any difference of opinion. As for if a person stole the money, deposited it in their bank accounts amongst their other money that is permissible, that's a different story, right? But if they took the money straight from that person's pocket and bought the water with that exact money, then we know that it's haram. And that's the story of Sayyidina Abu Bakr, that the person bought the milk that he gave Abu Bakr with the money that he got for doing soothsaying before he was Muslim, right? So that money was haram. He purchased something halal with it, and that halal thing became haram because of that money, because of a secondary effect. So between the two, we have this doubtful matters, which is the topic that we're trying to, inshallah, explain. Right. So for the one who has a lack of knowledge, the halal may also be unclear to them, right? And that which is clear of the haram may also be unclear to them. I remember when I first became Muslim, I used to go for Fajr, right? When I found out you could actually pray in the mosque. So I used to go for Fajr, and then I would go after Fajr, I would go to Wawa and get a giant meatball, 12-inch, foot-long meatball sandwich. Right? And I did this for like a while. Right? And then one of my friends, he came up to me, and this is the first night of Ramadan, later to Nadra, the night of the divine gaze. And he said to me, bro, you can't be doing that. That's not halal. I'm like, it's not pork, right? And he's like, no. It's more than just pork. There's other things you can't eat as well. It has to be slaughtered and all these things. I didn't know that for months. I was just a brand new Muslim. So if someone has a lack of knowledge, even that which is clearly haram may be doubtful for them. Right? They may not know where that lies, halal or haram. So this hadith only really works, right, if we apply the other hadith that seeking knowledge is obligatory for every Muslim. Right? Without that as a foundation, without at least a foundational amount of knowledge, the personally obligatory amount of knowledge, which does not take a long time, right? Someone could easily cover what is personally obligatory on them in less than a year. If they're dedicated full time, maybe a year or so if they're doing it along with other things. And it takes time, but it's not difficult. It's not complicated to get that level of knowledge. But if there is no framework of knowledge to work with, then this hadith doesn't really apply, right? It's just assuming that we have a basic amount of knowledge, that we know what the halal is clearly, we know what the haram is clearly, and in between the two, this is when we consult scholars, this is when we start to increase in our knowledge, then the middle ground of the doubtful matters becomes known. Right? We become amongst the qalil, the few people who do know about that. Tamam. So exactly what are doubtful matters is important. What we have to understand what shubuhat, in Arabic shubuha, is the word when things are confused, right? And Bani Israel was commanded to slaughter a cow, and they said, "Inna al-baqara tashabaha alayna," same word, right? Cows are confusing, right? To tell the difference between all these different types of cows and these different descriptions are confusing. Tell us exactly which cow you want, right? Make it easy for us. So the word shubaha, right, applies to things that are unclear, it's not very clear where they lie. Are they of the halal category or are they of the haram category? Tamam. Right, so this could be due to various reasons. Right, why would something be unclear? Right, there's multiple reasons why they can be unclear. One, and which is probably the most important one, is intentional ambiguity of the Quran and the Hadith. Intentional ambiguity. Right, so the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah has clarified what is halal and what has clarified what is haram, and He has been silent about other things. Right, He has intentionally, not out of forgetfulness, He intentionally did not mention certain things. Right, or in the sake of the Quran or the Hadith, there is intentional usage of words that are open to interpretations. Right, instead of saying clearly, wipe 1/4 of your head or wipe your whole head in wudu. Right, Allah says, "Wamsahu bi ru'usikum," wipe with your heads or on your heads or using your heads. Right, there's many different ways to interpret that ba. There's 12 meanings of ba in the Arabic language. So Imam Malik said that ba means you have to wipe the whole head, right? And he's using tayammum as his comparative proof, because in tayammum you have to wipe your whole face, and the same ba is there. Wamsahu bi wujuhikum, wipe your faces, but the same ba is there. So in tayammum you wipe your whole face, so it's the same ba in the verse of wiping your heads for wudu, right? So it must be the whole head. Imam Shafi'i said bi means ba'd, some of your head. Right, so the least amount that would be called wiping would be considered obligatory in the Shafi'i school. Thalatha sha'arat, just a small wipe would be sufficient. All from the same ba. In the Hanafi school, ba goes on the thing that you use. So if I said I wiped the whiteboard with the eraser, I would put the ba on the eraser part. Right, so it's saying wipe with your heads. So if I took a wet hand, put it here, and then moved my head, right, the minimum that would be considered wiping would be about 1/4, right? Plus other hadith and everything. And everyone has more than just that as a proof, but just one ba, right, has led to 3 different, right, opinions, right? And no one is saying to do anything less than wipe the full head. That's the sunnah. But if someone did do less than that, would it be valid, right, according to this scholar or that scholar, right? So there's intentional ambiguity in the Quran. There are things that are not black and white. They're not meant to be black and white. And even the Prophet ﷺ, he gave instructions that were open to interpretation. He sent a group of companions to the tribe of Banu Qurayza, which is to the east of where the Muslim area of Medina was. And he told them, do not pray Asr until you reach Banu Qurayza. Right? So these two companions are traveling, and Asr time comes in. Okay? And they're still not there, right? So one of them says, nope, right? We're not at Banu Qurayza yet. The Prophet said, do not pray Asr until you're at Banu Qurayza, right? And so he did not pray. The other one saying, it's almost Maghrib, right? It is more important to not miss Asr than it is to follow that literal meaning of that ruling. So he prayed. And they came back to the Prophet ﷺ, and they both told them that I did this, and the other one said, I did this. 2 differing opinions about the same essential instruction. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, as for one of them, right, you have done well, and as for the other, you will be rewarded. Right? And this happened many times where the Prophet ﷺ condoned both opinions because they were based on true scholarship. Another example is a person was traveling, and he decided to pray the shortened version of the prayer as a traveler, and the other one prayed the longer version. And he said to the one who shortened the prayer, "Asabta sunnah, you have done the sunnah." And he said to the one who did the full prayer that you will get rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there is a breadth and a room allowed, or intentionally put in the way things are worded in the Quran and the Hadith to allow for an expansive amount of understandings. So intentional ambiguity is one of the most important blessings of Islam. It is not a deficiency whatsoever. It is a blessing that allows for differences of opinion, which there's a famous statement. Some people have ascribed this to the Prophet ﷺ, that the difference of opinion of my community is a mercy. The difference of opinion of my community is a mercy. Tamam. And this existed since the time of the Sahaba in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, while the Prophet ﷺ was still alive, and he trained them to think in this way. He trained them to come to their own opinions in cases where it's not clear in the Quran and Hadith. The second reason why there could be a doubtful matter, meaning a matter that's not obviously halal or obviously haram, it's somewhere in the between, is based on non-definitive proofs, right? So this would be an entire discussion itself if we went into full detail, but essentially there are definitive proofs and there are non-definitive proofs. Definitive proofs are they're definitive in either their authenticity, right? So all of the verses of the Quran are definitive in their authenticity. Right? Mutawatir and Sahih hadiths are definitive in their authenticity. Right? They are affirmed and guaranteed to be directly from the Prophet ﷺ. But lesser strength hadith would be what's considered non-definitive in their authenticity. So a weak hadith, can we use that? Yes, but for certain things only. We can't use them to establish creedal points of belief. We can't use them to establish by themselves rulings of the Sharia. We can use them as supporting evidence for other rulings of Sharia. But there's another type of non-definitive proofs, which is definitive in their meaning. Definitive in their meaning, meaning they only give one meaning. It's not up to interpretation. It doesn't allow for other interpretation. It only has one meaning. So most of the verses of the Quran are of this nature of definitive in their meaning. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that in the Quran there are definitive verses and there are ambiguous verses, mutashabihat, same word is shubuhat. Right? And as for the definitive verses, they make up the majority of the book. Right? And as for the ambiguous verses, then only those who are firmly footed in knowledge know about them. Right? And then there's a little bit of middle part that I skipped over for brevity's sake. So if there's a verse like "Qul huwallahu ahad," there's no interpretations of that. Right? It just means one thing, that there is only one singular, unique, right, creator. But what about the verses about let's see a good example. About the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a clear example, but that's more of an aqidah thing. About certain rulings, we talked about the wiping of the head in the wudu. There's a lot of things about the salats. There's many things that are open to interpretations. There you have one verse, but it could mean this. It's a legitimate meaning in the Arabic language to mean this. It's a legitimate meaning in the Arabic language that could mean this. It's a legitimate Arabic meaning, it could mean this. That intentional ambiguity, right, allows for a breadth of opinions in the sacred law. Or it could be a non-definitive in its authenticity, like a singular narration hadith. It could be a weak hadith, and there's multiple types of weak hadith. There's multiple types of sahih hadith, right? So I really don't like when people come and say, "Is that hadith sahih?" Right? Like, come on, bro. Like, what type of sahih? Sahih li ghayrihi, sahih li dhatihi, sahih bi taqawwiyat at-turuq. Which of the 5 types of sahih are you talking about? It's not just one thing called sahih. Right? It's a very, very, very deep science of hadith. Another reason for the difference of opinion and the unclear matters is facilitating religious practice for extenuating circumstances. For circumstances that are not easy, they don't just fit the mold of normal religious life. Right? What if someone is Muslim, they're a convert, and their parents hate Islam, and it's Ramadan? So if they even see them trying to cook a meal before Sahur, right, they're going to kick them out of the house. Right? There's no clear-cut ruling for that situation. Right? The Quran gives us principles. Right? And hadith gives us principles, but it doesn't tell us every single answer to every single question. Right? It allows us the framework to make those decisions and through the way of the scholars. And it also applies to different places. Right? So Imam Shafi'i, when he was first in Egypt, right? Was it Egypt first or Palestine? He was first in Palestine. May Allah give ease and well-being to the people of Palestine. He had a certain set of rulings that he felt were the correct rulings according to his ijtihad, his scholarly efforts. But when he moved to Egypt, he kind of edited some of those rulings because the Egyptians were not the same people as the Palestinians. So different times and places dictate different rulings for certain things. I'll just mention one story about the extenuating circumstances. There was a sister, she had extreme eczema, and she was unable to make wudu, and because she had all over her arms and her body. So she was making tayammum. She was doing dry ablution as an alternative to the wudu, which is permissible. But she was making tayammum such that she would touch the soil, and then she would wipe her hands up to her wrist only. And then she would do it again, and she would wipe her face. Right? So in the Hanafi school, which she was a Hanafi, she said that she would follow the Hanafi school. In the Hanafi school, the minimum obligation of the tayammum is to wipe from your fingertips to the including your elbows, all the way up to your elbows. So what do? Do you tell her to make up 8 years of prayer? Right? Is that what the Sharia wants us to do? Is that what Allah wants us to do? Right? If it was black and white, there was no middle, there was no gray area for these things, and all the rulings were either this or that, there would be no room for her. Sorry, you have to make up 8 years of prayer. Sorry. Afwan. And then many people, if they were put in that situation, their relationship with Allah will be affected. Some people may even leave Islam if they're at level 1 or level 2 or level 3, and you told them to make 8 years of prayer, and they're barely waking up for Fajr now. Right? They're just going to I give up. So the sacred law allows us not only to use the weak opinions within a singular school, if you're sticking within one school, it allows us to take opinions from other schools to benefit people's religious lives and relationship with Allah, to make it easy for them to practice their deen. Right? So in the Maliki school, it is the obligatory amount of the tayammum is to wipe from your hands, or your tips of your fingers to your wrist. It is sunnah to go all the way up to your elbows. Right? So the scholar would tell this girl that all of your 8 years of prayers are considered valid and according to the Maliki school. Right? But from here on out, if you're following the Hanafi school, you should do it this way. That is mercy. It's absolute mercy. Right? And this is not something that's of this time. Even at the time of the Tabi'een and the Tabi'een. Right? Abu Yusuf, rahimahullah ta'ala, the student of Imam Abu Hanifa, he led the Jum'ah prayer in a masjid. And then someone came to him after everyone has dispersed and said there was a dead rat in the well. There was a dead rat in the well. In a Hanafi school, that water would be impure immediately. You have to take out the rat. You would have to take out 20 to 40 buckets of water, and then you can make wudu. Right? So essentially, the ruling in the moment would be that you'd have to find all of those people, tell them that their Jum'ah is invalid, redo the whole Jum'ah, right, and redo the prayer. But that's haraj. That's undue difficulty. That's too difficult to do. So he said, نُقَلِّدْ إِخْوَانَنَا مِنَ الشَّافِعِيَّةِ. So we'll take the opinion of the Shafi'is in this regard because of the religious benefit and need at the moment. This is a mercy for the ummah. So this is intentional ambiguity is there for a reason. A second reason why it's there, besides it being a difference of opinion, the second wisdom is it's a test of cautiousness. It's a test of cautiousness. If there was only one ruling, we would not know who was truly trying and devoting themselves to the next level of cautiousness and those who are just doing the minimum, because there is just one thing. It's just the minimum. The minimum is the only thing. But if there is a clear minimum and then levels of cautiousness above that, we can distinguish between the one who is at level 1, 2, or 3, or even 4, and those who are at level 9. And those are at level 7, and those who are at level 8, right? There's a distinguishment between them. There's a level of, there's ranks of religious practice, right? And sincerity is something only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. But we see this in the Quran as well. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sets minimums, right? So the letter of the law is the minimum for every Muslim, the letter of the law, right? But there are things that are above that. So the letter of the law would be can or cannot. Is it permissible? Can you do it, or are you not allowed to do it? right? But the Quran is not just calling to that minimum level, it's calling to a higher level called shoulds or should nots, right? But it's not making shoulds or should nots obligatory on everyone, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَإِنْ عَاقَبْتُمْ فَعَاقِبُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا عُوقِبْتُمْ بِهِ, that if you retaliate, then retaliates to the extent that you were aggressed against. وَإِنْ صَبَرْتُمْ وَلَئِنْ صَبَرْتُمْ لَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لِلصَّابِرِينَ, and if you bear patiently, then it is better for those who are patient. So there's a minimum level that if you're going to retaliate, okay, it's permissible, but with this condition, that you can't exceed more than what they've done to you, right? But there's a call to a higher level. But if you are patient, right, then that is better for those the people of patience. And obviously this has its own context. The interesting thing is that all of the prophets were called to the shoulds and should nots, not the cans and can-nots. Even though technically, if they left a should, if they left what they're supposed to do, the more ideal position, it would not be legally considered a sin. But in their regard, they would be rebuked for it. Right, so if the Prophet ﷺ chose to retaliate instead of being patient in this context, the specific context this verse was related in, right, then that would be considered something Allah would mention in the Quran, that you should not have done that, right? But it was not a sin, right? And the same thing applies to Adam and the apple, and it's the same thing if it was actually apple. The same thing applies to all of these different stories that seemingly look like sins, but for them it was just coming down from what they should be doing to what is technically permissible, right? So it is not a sin. But if there was only one thing, you have to be patient, right? Then there's no proof that this person is going above and beyond the minimum, because the only thing there is one thing. The second thing is, it's as a test whether one will seek out sound scholarship or whether they will act without knowledge or based on mere opinion. If something is doubtful, it's like, I should be all right? How many times have you heard that? I should be okay, right? There's a huge difference between that person and the person who's like, no, let me ask, let me make sure first, right? Between in the relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are worlds apart. The different mindsets are also come to the forefront because of this difference of opinion. If it was only one ruling, then both people would be doing the same thing. So there are many wisdoms for the presence of this middle area, this gray area. But how do we, as Muslims here in the U.S. in 2023, how do we navigate these doubtful matters if we are not necessarily somebody who has dedicated many years to formal study of Islam? So how do we navigate them? This is probably the most practical part of this session. So first and foremost, right, it requires knowledge, as we mentioned, right? Knowledge and a connection to trained scholarship. Imam Al-Ghazali, and I'll just quote what he says in the Ihya. He says, one must not busy themselves with the subtleties of scrupulousness and caution except under the supervision of a trained scholar. If one goes into that which they have no knowledge of, relying only on one's mere opinion without formally taking their knowledge from a scholar, they will cause more harm than good. They will cause more harm than good, right? So these doubtful matters, there requires either knowledge, right, that one themselves is acquiring, or access to knowledge that they can ask about. Right? In the verse of the Quran that Ustad Amjad mentioned in the khutbah, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. This is a conditional statement, that if you don't know, then it's an obligation to ask. But the second thing that we need to know, right? So knowledge is a foundation. Everyone should have a portion of it. And even if they have already studied, right, they should continue that study until they meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is not an all or nothing thing. It is not something that you graduate from, right? And the personally obligatory level of knowledge is not, the obligation is not to have done it at some point in your life, That is not the obligation. It's like, oh, I took a class in 2010, like some of my obligations fulfilled. No, do you know all of that stuff in the moment? That if something happened in your prayer, you know exactly what to do. If something happened in your wudu, you know whether it's broken or not. Right? If you don't have that moment, that knowledge, that minimum level of knowledge with you at that moment, at all moments, essentially, right? Then that obligation refreshes. It renews. Oh, I forgot this issue. Obligation returns to return to that issue and revise it and relearn that issue. As they say, that knowledge is what you take to the bathroom with you. Akramakumullah. You won't walk into the bathroom with Sahih al-Bukhari. You're not going to walk in the bathroom with reliance of the traveler under your arm. No one's going to do that, right? So if maybe you're out traveling, something happens. Maybe you're at a restaurant, something happens, right? So this knowledge has to be a companion at all times. It has to be there, and it's not a complicated level of knowledge. So that is the foundation. But secondly, we have to learn together. We have to learn what is properly placed caution, right? Because proper caution is recommended. Right? As a general rule, caution is always recommended, but it has to be properly placed caution. Misplaced caution is not part of our deen. Has nothing to do with our deen. It is not piety. So properly placed caution is something that is that there is a type of proof involved. There's evidence, right, that this thing is either impermissible or that this thing is invalid. Secondly, or there is reasonable surety, the reasonable likelihood. You're almost certain, near certainty, that something is impermissible or something that is invalid. And then the last way that one could kind of categorize this is that in issues of major consequence or when there is great difficulty, then consultation has to be made. That's the point where someone asked yesterday, like, when do we have to ask? As opposed to being able to make that decision on our own, that this is definitely something. So haraj is undue difficulty. If things are difficult, something's wrong. It's not part of the deen. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ haraj. He has not placed any undue difficulty upon you in the religion. So if someone is making wudu 8 times in a row, someone's taking ghusl 3 times in a row because of what ifs, right? That is haraj. That is undue difficulty. Something's wrong. Either there is a lack of knowledge, or there is a dispensation waiting for you because your circumstances are different than others, right? And those generally are, all those issues are solved with one of those 2 things. Either it's a lack of knowledge, right? Someone didn't understand the things that break the wudu, or someone didn't understand what are the obligations of wudu as opposed to the sunnahs of wudu, or they have extenuating circumstances. Right? And it is the job of the scholars to give them facilitation to them. So if there are recognized doubts, if there are doubts that are legitimate, doubts that are supported with either proofs or reasonable surety or reasonable likelihood that this thing is problematic or haram or invalid, right? Then if something was permissible or valid, right, and then there's a doubt to the contrary, then we have to have principles, first thing, before I mention that. If there is recognized doubts, right, then we have to have principles. If something is initially valid or permissible, right, and then something creeps in that's, but maybe it's impermissible because of this, or maybe it became invalid because of this, there is a principle in the sacred law that al-yaqinu la yazulu bi-shak. Certainty cannot be removed by doubt. Certainty cannot be removed by doubt. So brother Zubair makes wudu, and he goes to pray he gets in a car and he drives to Al-Maqasid to pray Dhuhr in congregation in the front saf with the first takbir of the imam. He used the siwak and everything. But then but maybe I broke my wudu. Maybe I didn't. Did I have wudu or did I break my wudu? Right, so he had wudu. He was absolutely certain that he made wudu. And then there's doubts, right, baseless doubts without proof, without any supporting evidence that he broke his wudu, right? That certainty cannot be removed by just mere hypothetical doubt, right? So he still has wudu, right? If Zubair did not have wudu and he comes to Maqasid and he says, did I make wudu or not? Right? So there's doubt whether he made wudu or not. But originally, we have certainty that he did not have wudu. Right? We know for a fact he did not have wudu, and the doubt is whether he did or not. Then the yaqeen cannot be removed by doubt. Right? He would just make wudu. As opposed to any what if creeping in. Let me just do it again. It's just more, it's cautious. I might as well just do it again just to be safe. These are danger words. Danger words, because waswasa is an epidemic in the ummah. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions a week of people making ghusl 5 times, washing their entire house because someone touched something that was najis, and they touched a doorknob, and then someone else touched a doorknob, and then they touched a microwave, and then someone touched the microwave, and they touched the counter. Do I have to clean my whole house? Islam is too difficult. I'm thinking about leaving. I'm dead serious. It's comical in one nature, but it's extremely sad. Right? And this is misplaced caution. That's exactly what it is misplaced caution. Right? So misplaced caution is reconsidering a ruling of something that is clearly lawful or clearly valid due to hypothetical possibilities. What ifs? What ifs, conjecture, are not to be acted upon at all whatsoever. What ifs have no weight in the sacred law. If there is some evidence, some support, something that is makes it likely that that thing is possible, then okay, that's a different story. There's some proof behind it. But just mere what ifs is not proper caution. Leaving that which is of clear benefit or need due to minority differences of opinion. Right? So it's like, well, I'm not really sure about the mawlid. Some people said you shouldn't do it, and some people said you should do it. It's better that I just leave it. Right? But maybe that's that person's, that mawlid would be of such great benefit for that person's deen that that's what they need. And there's room in the sacred law to allow that for that person. They shouldn't leave it just because some people said this. Right? So there's one sense it's okay, leaving difference of opinion is is recommended. Right? But for certain people, there's such a benefit in that thing or such a need in that thing. Right? And there's no other alternatives in the community to fulfill that requirement, then for them, leaving that just because of that is misplaced. Right? They should consult instead of just making that decision on their own. Another way to diagnose misplaced caution is harder is not always better. Harder is not always better. Right? Someone, did I pray 3 rakats or 4 rakats? Right? Let me just start over. Right? No. Right? I'm not sure if they changed their gloves over here, so I'll just not eat at all today. Right? No. Right? So harder is not always better. Right? Just because something's more difficult doesn't mean that that's the cautious position. Sometimes the right choice is to do the easier thing. The Prophet ﷺ, whenever he was put a choice between 2 things was put to him, as long as neither of them was haram, he would always choose the lesser of the 2, difficulty. He would choose the easier of the 2. Always choose the easier of the 2, right? As long as there was no sin involved in the other ones. And say the Aisha, she narrates this hadith, she says, if there was any sin involved, he was the furthest people from it. Imbalanced caution also would apply to someone aiming too high, too fast. As Sheikh Yahya said, we don't want to crawl if we're able to walk. Right? We don't want to do less than we know that we can do. We want to try to live at our potential, at that level of where we're still pushing, but not pushing too much. But he also said that we don't want to run too fast if we're going to trip up. Right, so if someone is at a 2 or a 3 or a 4 and they say, okay, it's cautious to do this. Yeah, it's cautious for the 6 or for the 7 to do that, and they should do that. But for you, right, start with this. Start with a lower level of caution and work one's way up to that. Right, so aiming too high, too fast is also another example. And then the last principle is a principle that our blessed teacher, Sheikh Faraz, he made a really beautiful point. And the context was about eating, about food. He was saying that a lot of people, they want to eat whatever they want. They want to eat whatever they want, but they still want to be cautious. Like, I want to go down the candy aisle. I want this, I want that, I want that, I want that, but I also want to be cautious. So that just leads to undue difficulty in life. It leads to, so now they're checking every single ingredient. They got their Google on one hand, they got the item on the other hand. You can barely even read the writing because it's scientific words and stuff, and they're Googling, what does this mean? Oh, it could be from vegetable, or it could be from this. Next, right? They're going next one, and they have these apps now. You can scan them, right? If someone is going to try, they want access to everything in the world, but they also want to do it in a cautious way, right? It's going to lead to very great difficulty. I want to eat at every restaurant in all of Allentown, right? But I want to make sure that they have all these conditions that I take as caution. That's going to be very difficult, right? So a lot of these scrupulousness has a prerequisite condition of just being content with less. Okay? And the Prophet ﷺ said that the dunya is the prison of the believer. It is the paradise of the disbeliever. They can do whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want. Right? They don't have this pull to do that which is higher and to transcend, to abide by the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which are again for our benefit. Right? So there is a restriction. There is definitely a restriction. There are things that we can't do. There are things that we have to do at certain times. So like we might not be able to do one straight shot, right? Just go to Dorney Park and spend the whole day without having to stop. We have to stop for salah. We have to stop for this. We have to make wudu. We have to go, right? Figure out a way to make wudu. Find a place to pray. Whereas other people may be singing, they're having fun and everything. Right, but there is no doubt whatsoever that this is what we were created to do, right? And this is absolute paradise inwardly in this world, and then the actual paradise in the hereafter. So as long as we understand it through that framework, then we're okay with restrictions, right? But putting self-restrictions on ourselves while still wanting to do whatever we want, whenever we want, it's going to lead to a type of inner dichotomy that's just going to tear us apart. So that's pretty much what we wanted to talk about. There is a lot to say about each of these points as regards the usul al-fiqh and the fiqh perspectives. So if there are any questions, I don't know how much time we have, but we can take some. Alhamdulillah. Because I think there were some questions yesterday that weren't answered, so we can take those as well. There's a microphone.
So beyond the description, unnecessary caution, or so beyond that, in terms of actual necessary caution, where would you necessarily draw the line between employing something like فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, or completely leaving something, like, because you mentioned دع ما يريبك, وسكت عن أشياء رحمة لكم, and then so it would be between either leaving it or asking a scholar. But then there's also like فإنما أهلك الذين من قبلكم. So I mean, so where would you draw the line between asking for assistance or just leaving it because it would be better to leave it?
Jamil. So first and foremost, so if there is something where doing it would be of benefit, religious benefit, or even worldly benefit, or doing it would make your life significantly easier, either in a religious manner or in even in a worldly manner, right? Or not doing that thing would cause undue difficulty or make life a little bit hard, right? Then I would not just go out and just leave it due to a sense of caution. I wouldn't just abandon it, because one, I could be depriving myself of some benefit or some need or some facilitation in my religious or worldly life that if it is halal, right, then I could have easily done that without any qualms. If in the other sense, if I abandon it and I make my life difficult, right, that may be the worst of two evils, right? That if it is technically halal, then I can do it, and everything in my life still remains within the realm of facilitation and ease. So if it's something of that consequence, I would definitely ask. And the hadith about that the people before us were destroyed because of their constant asking of the Prophet, many of the scholars of hadith commentary mentioned that their questions were not questions of istifsar al-hukm. They weren't really asking what the ruling was. They were asking in an objecting way. Why do we have to do this? Why do we have to do this? Why do we have to do this? Like Bani Israel, Musa alayhi salam told them that Allah has commanded you to slaughter a cow. And they said, are you joking? It's that type of questioning that they mention. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he encouraged questions. He said, in the Mashifa'ul Ayi Su'al, the only cure to not knowing is asking. Imam Abu Hanifa, he said that he was asked, how did you attain such knowledge? He said, bi lisan sa'ul wa qalbin aqul, with a tongue that always asked questions, right? And a heart that understood those answers. So if it was something other than that, right, there's not necessarily any consequence to me leaving it, right? It's just okay. It's just a different flavor of Skittles, right? Or I'm eating like a Turkish substitute of Starburst, right? Like, it's okay, khalas. Right? It's not something of consequence. Then just immediately act. You don't have to ask. You don't have to. And I think that's that autonomy that people want to have, that they don't need to ask all the time. And especially when, as Sheikh Yahya mentioned, we're understaffed. It's not easy to get your answers immediately answered while you're standing in the aisle in the supermarket and you're waiting. Is he going to reply? Is he going to reply? Right? That's not necessarily practical. So if it's not a great consequence, right, whether you do it or not, then I would just act cautiously. If it is something that it's going to affect you either in a positive way or a non-positive way, then I would definitely ask. And hope that kind of breaks it. We'll just do it one by one.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for the talk. My question was in the context of deciding between doing the lawful over the unlawful or trying to choose what is better. How do we understand forgetfulness? Is there a component of any satanic waswasa in that, sort of maybe reminiscent of the story in Surah Al-Kahf with Prophet Musa alayhi salam? And if that is the case, what can we do to help us remember if it's, a momentary lapse in memory?
MashaAllah. Good question, MashaAllah. In general, forgetfulness is pardoned. The Prophet said that Allah has pardoned my ummah with regards to forgetfulness and doing something accidentally, right? Or mastukriha alihi, something that someone was forced to do. Right? And there's other narrations as well that maybe a fourth thing. So in general, forgetfulness is excused, or even to the extent that if someone's fasting and they eat, right, their fast is still valid. They would continue. I had a teacher, he ate a whole plate of fried shrimp. A whole plate of fried shrimp with ketchup, right, tea on the side. Then he rinsed his mouth out, washed his hand, and then he turned, oh wait, I'm fasting. Right? Right, so the Prophet said that is food that Allah gave you. Allah fed you. Right, so it's to that extent that forgetfulness in that regard, right, is a gift from Allah. Right, so not all the time forgetfulness is a bad thing. That never happens to me, by the way. I forget a lot of things. Ask my wife, but I never forget that I'm fasting. Right, tamam. So if someone does forget, then there's no sin upon them. They may have to redo the action or something if it's something other than fasting. But if it's something habitual, it just keeps happening. If it's out of neglect, or heedlessness, then that can be cured by increasing in dhikr, pausing and thinking before doing actions, having a bit more mindfulness. Having a bit more introspection about intentions, and having a stillness of the heart, which is slowly being robbed away from all of us through social media, right? And before it was YouTube videos that were like half an hour long. Now it's 3-second clips and 3-minute clips, and right, even that you don't want to see it to the end because you just have to keep going, right? So stillness is one of the greatest qualities to have is in a spiritual sense, because it allows a person to make good intentions in the moment, because they're still. It allows people to have a deeper focus in their prayer. So that's if the forgetfulness is due to a type of heedlessness or neglect, right? If it's just something like, oh, you forgot this or that, then don't be hard on yourself whatsoever. And these are things that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned. that Allah has pardoned entirely. Who's got the microphone? I think there's a brother over here too. We need your mitigation.
Yeah. So we have, sorry, it's Exalted and me. Yes. Okay, and then do we have any sisters have questions? Okay, so we'll go from Muhammad to Amrit. Ali Kareem. Sure. Okay. To Amir and Zayd.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
So in terms of the hadith, you mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ wasn't given two options except that he chose the easiest. I know like a lot of people reference that hadith and sort of argue that because of that we should just choose the easiest opinion from every madhab. So what would be like the response to that?
Subhanallah. Yeah. So I honestly didn't know people were using it for that reason. I thought they were using other things for that reason. Yeah, so the scholar, like the rulings of other schools, right, are there for a reason, right? So it's not like they're inaccessible. There's a giant vault between us and other schools, and you can't take anything from them. And that's not the case. However, following one school, right, it gives such benefits to the life of the Muslim. It's just irreplaceable benefit. It's something that we really, really need to appreciate, right? Following one school of thought, because it just gives us a systematic approach to life. It gives us absolute clarity in things, right? With the understanding that other opinions do exist and we respect other opinions, right? And if something happened to us, some extenuating circumstances or meet somebody who's a convert or someone who's having a difficult time in their deen, then we understand that those things are there as tools to help people worship Allah and help people rise in the ranks. But the scholars, even though some scholars say it's wajib to follow one madhab, most scholars said that it's not intrinsically wajib to follow a specific madhab, but it is wajib to follow scholarship. But they all agree that it is impermissible to take from other schools with two conditions. If these two things are found, or any one of these two things are found, it's impermissible. One is tashahi, that they're doing it out of mere whim or desire, just because it's easier, right? And that's the answer to your question, right? That it is impermissible to take a more relaxed position of another school, or even a weak position in one's own school, just merely because it's easier, right? And there's no undue difficulty that one's trying to facilitate. It's just because I don't feel like making wudu again, right? That's not permissible according to all of the schools. And the second one is that there's no talfiq. That if there's talfiq, and we'll explain what that means, then it's also impermissible. Talfiq means that you take an opinion of another school in a way that is contradictory, right? So, for instance, say I make wudu, right, and I follow the Hanafi school. Say I touched the hand of my spouse. Right, so in Hanafi school, my wudu is still valid, right? But then as I approach the masjid, I get a little bit of a nosebleed. I'm like, man, it's cold. Right? I don't feel like making wudu again. There's a long line, right? So I'm just gonna follow the Shafi'i school, right? And then I join the prayer, Allahu Akbar, right? So my wudu and my prayer are invalid according to both the Hanafi school and the Shafi'i school. Right, because according to Imam Abu Hanifa, my wudu is not valid because my nose bled, and according to Imam Shafi'i, rahimahumullah, right, my wudu is not valid because I touched my spouse. So neither of the scholars would say that prayer is valid, right? So that is impermissible as well, right? So other than that, right, then generally if you have an option, it's like, okay, I want to take this route, or this route's a little bit easier, right? Then the Prophet would take the easier one and make that intention to take the easier thing. It's like, okay, either I can drive 8 hours, right, to this place, or I can go to this other masjid for this other program that's only 5 minutes away, right? These are the kind of easier things that she was mentioning. It wasn't necessarily fiqh rulings, right? As we read yesterday, that the Prophet ﷺ didn't need ijtihad, right? There weren't madhabs at that time because they were not needed at that time. But as for taking from other schools just on the basis that it's just a little easier, right, out of whims, then that's not permissible according to any of the scholars. it's actually very damaging.
And then
Who's next? Anyway, and beside.
but
Sometimes with like our family, we get invited to dinner and stuff. Either they're not practicing or they're not Muslim, and they offer us food, whether it not be halal or you doubt it. But even if you know for certain it's not halal, and you know if you continue to deny the food, they'll get offended, and you're almost certain it will push them further away from Islam. What do we do in that situation?
Yeah, that is a very common situation. Actually, one of the sisters asked about this yesterday. If you're invited to someone's house and they serve you food and you either suspect that it's not halal or you know it's not halal, but you don't want to hurt their feelings or drive them away from Islam, it's a tough spot to be in, especially if it's a family member, because there's multiple layers of religious, important religious issues that are involved with keeping ties with the family and being respectful to your parents, but at the same time not obeying the creation in anything that's disobedience to the Creator. So a lot of this just takes tact, patience, as beautiful as possible to respectfully decline. If one can prevent this from happening ahead of time, that would be a lot better. Right, so and many people these days, they have dietary restrictions, and people accommodate, like, oh, I'm gluten-free and I can't eat nuts and I can't eat this, right? And they'll tell them ahead of time. But if we just show up and we haven't told them anything, and they made this giant steak dinner or something, right? And we can't just sit there and eat mashed potatoes, like, right? I mean, you still have to sit there and eat mashed potatoes if it's completely haram, because that would just be clear disobedience of Allah. But to prevent that would be a lot better. It's like, okay, can we just eat something like fish or some seafood, or so mitigating. But if someone is in that situation, you just got to say, I'm sorry. I really, really, really am terribly sorry. But in my religion, I can't eat unslaughtered meat, and just pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows the bad consequences of that to be mitigated and to fall away at the wayside. Now, I wouldn't really publicize this. I mean, I wanted to, because this is what we're talking about. Like, if someone was a convert, for instance, right, and they had non-Muslim family members, and say they follow the Hanafi school, right, and then their family's like, oh, they're discussing, they're making meals as they're to prepare for their son or their daughter to come, and they're like, oh, he can't eat meat. Remember, he can't eat pork. He can't eat meat. Right? Okay, let's make him lobster, right? And crab, right? And they make this giant seafood thing, right? And then the son comes and is like, well, according to the Hanafi school, I can't eat that either, right? So there is a mercy in having these other opinions. Like, if it's the difference between them being averse to Islam, right, and me taking a valid opinion of another school, right, then I would probably choose to take that opinion from the other school in that situation. Right, from there on, I would try to mitigate that, right, and not to have to do that all the time. Right, because like if it was my parents, like they kind of understand now the whole thing about slaughtered meat. But if I told them I can't eat crabs also or lobster, they would just be like, oh my goodness, what's going on? This is too much. So there is a little bit of room when things are not clearly disobedience. Right? Clear disobedience, there are valid differences of opinion. But if that can be mitigated ahead of time, then that's best. It's best.
So,
I think it was Zayd. Do you mind if I go that? You have any microphone? Okay. Bismillah. Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
What do you do when a Muslim invites you to their home?
Oh man.
And you know in the area in which you live, there is no halal that can meat. And they in the kitchen, they got a pot full of chicken legs, and and you know, it's like, wow, you wonder, like, is this, I don't, the for instance, this area here,
Yeah.
allow meat stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, okay, but I was glad that didn't happen. So the brother asked me, he said, well, my wife is cooking, could you keep more? And I'm like, I told him on the phone, I said, well, because I remember saying, I said, you have any fish? I like fish, man, But how do you handle that normally? And I think when you picked up on it, and
Yeah.
it is difficult.
No, it is definitely difficult because at the same time, you don't want to hurt people's feelings. You don't want to be insensitive to and not everyone's on the same level of caution. So if they're trying to do something nice for you, it's an awkward, tough, difficult situation. It happened to me many, many times. I think Sheikh Yahya will talk about like when do you have to ask and when do you not have to ask. When can you assume that it's fine? In general, just as a really quick thing, that if they are people of outward religious practice, right? And the second condition is probably harder to determine. And you know that they have knowledge of what halal means, then you don't have to ask. Right? So someone can be very religious and very sincere, but they don't necessarily know the difference between halal and or slaughtered or unslaughtered or this or that. And they may be following a very minority opinion that you can just say Bismillah on anything. Right, you can get like a double Whopper with cheese and say Bismillah. Why? Right. So that's the second part is the harder one, because they're sincere, they're really doing it for your sake, and it's just tough. It's just tough. Right. I would just be really open and just really honest. Just be like, look, I understand that you bought this, right, believing that it's halal, but I follow a more strict opinion, and please forgive me, but I'm not able to, right, to come or to partake. And then whatever happens is in the hands of Allah, because this is not something that you're not wronging them, right, by standing on principles. Especially it's something, right, it's harder with Muslims than it is with non-Muslims sometimes. Because then they're offended, right? I got yelled at the other day. Someone asked me if I was non-Muslim for asking them if the meat was hand slaughtered. How are we on time? Okay, inshallah. Barakallahu fikum. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Inshallah. We'll speak together, inshallah. Zayd is one of the seminary students, so he sees me every day.